I found her swinging above the canyon, and I swear her eyes had already made peace with death. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind that soothes, not the kind that rests heavy on mountain air after snowfall, but the brittle silence that arrives when 100 people scream at once, and one life refuses to answer. She hung at the center of it, the rope groaning against the wood beam, her body swaying as if death had already chosen her rhythm. The wind ripped at her veil, tearing it just enough that I saw her eyes. They weren't wild with panic. They weren't begging. They looked resigned, as though death was not an enemy but an old companion she had finally decided to meet face to face. I should have walked away. I had no tribe, no loyalty, no stake in their justice. For years I had built a life on distance, surviving in cabins where even my own reflection refused to look me in the eye. But something in that moment, watching a woman whose silence roared louder than their chants, split the armor I had spent years hammering over myself. Why did they want her gone? What sin could carve such hatred into the faces of her own people? And why, of all men, did my boots carry me forward instead of back into the safety of the trees? I remember the heat of their torches, the sharp crack of wood beneath my steps as I placed myself on that bridge, each plank complaining under my weight as if urging me to reconsider. Men turned, rifles lifted slightly, spears tightening in fists. They didn't know my name, didn't need to. To them I was just another ghost from the mountains, a loner, scarred, faceless to their history. But her eyes found me. Even through the veil, even through the noose pulling at her breath, she saw me. And what she saw wasn't savior or outlaw, it was recognition. She recognized something I hadn't admitted to myself. Exile. She was their outcast. I was my own. Two ghosts staring across a canyon connected by nothing but silence and the faint hum of a rope that threatened to snap. I gripped my knife. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning their voices. For one fragile instant I hesitated. Cutting her down meant stepping back into a world I had abandoned. It meant inviting their judgment and her story into the ruins of my own. But leaving her meant confirming the thing I feared most, that I had become nothing more than a shadow, a man too hollow to lift another's weight. The knife slashed clean through the rope. She fell, heavier than she looked, air rushing back into her body with a broken gasp. My knees slammed into the planks as I caught her, her body frail, her silence deeper than any wound I had ever seen. The crowd roared, confusion and fury tangled in their voices, but all of it blurred, because in my arms she stirred, her lips moved. At first I thought she was trying to breathe, to reclaim the air stolen from her, but then her eyes locked with mine, eyes that carried every bruise, every abandonment, every exile I had ever known. And then she whispered, not a plea, not gratitude, just a single word, quiet but sharp enough to cleave the years of silence I had wrapped myself in. Why? Why save me? Why now? Why you? But beneath her question was another that struck deeper. Why open yourself after years of closing off? Why risk wounds when scars have already hardened? Why offer trust when it has never been returned? Her question was not just for me. It was for both of us. When her body hit the ground, she whispered a word I wasn't ready to hear. Why? They called me a ghost long before I started believing it. The mountains had a way of swallowing men whole. Some came chasing gold, some fleeing debts, some hiding sins too heavy to confess. Me? I came because there was nothing left worth facing. My cabin sat crooked on the ridge, its roof patched with tin that moaned when the wind tore through. Inside, the walls carried smoke stains older than my solitude, and a cracked mirror leaned in the corner. I hadn't looked into it in years, not because I feared what I'd see, but because I already knew. A stranger. A man with eyes hollowed by choices that could never be undone. Loneliness wasn't sudden. It crept like snow. First silence felt like comfort, then comfort turned into necessity. Eventually, necessity became armor, until one day you forget what a voice other than your own sounds like. I told myself survival was enough. Days spent splitting wood, setting traps, skinning rabbits by the fire. Nights measured by how many logs I could spare before frost reached my bones. But survival is a poor replacement for living. You can fill your stomach and still starve where it matters. Sometimes I'd wander down toward the valley, stand outside old diners with flickering neon signs, watch couples argue over coffee they'd never finish. I'd see kids sprinting down cracked sidewalks, shoes slapping against pavement, their laughter cutting through the night air. And I'd stay in the shadows, unseen, letting their lives remind me of the one I had long buried. The truth? I wasn't hiding from them, I was hiding from myself. That night, after I cut her down, I carried the widow back to my cabin. Her weight felt strange against me, not heavy in body, but heavy in meaning. It had been years since I had carried anything human, years since I had allowed someone into my space, my silence. I laid her on the bedroll by the fire, the flames licking shadows across her veil. For hours she didn't stir. I listened to her breathing, shallow but steady, as if each inhale was bargaining with life not to leave her again. I wanted to speak, to ask who she was, why her people turned rope into justice, but my throat locked. Words felt foreign in my mouth, like trying to speak a language I had long forgotten. So I sat in silence, and she met me with silence of her own. Two ghosts in the same room, unwilling to haunt each other with truths not yet ready to surface. But silence is never empty. It carries weight. It carries questions. Why had I stepped onto that bridge? Why her? Why now? For years I had convinced myself I was beyond second chances. Redemption was for men who still believed they deserved it. But watching her chest rise and fall in the firelight, I felt something crack inside me, quiet as thawing ice. I didn't want to admit it yet. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. Yet here she was, alive in my cabin, turning my silence into a mirror I didn't want to face. Most widows mourn. She only stared at me as if mourning had no place left in her body. She woke at dawn, the light sliding through the cracks of my cabin like a blade. Her veil still clung to her, torn but stubborn, as though it too refused to surrender. When her eyes opened, they didn't dart around like prey. They locked onto me, steady, unflinching, cold. Not the cold of fear, but the cold of someone who had been betrayed too many times to offer warmth. I pushed a tin cup of water toward her. She didn't take it. I set down bread, dried venison. She stared at it as though food was a trap she knew too well. Her silence pressed against me, heavy, suffocating. I'd spent years building walls with silence. But her silence was different. Hers wasn't retreat, it was defiance. Hours passed. I split wood outside, letting the rhythm of the axe drown the questions pounding in my head. Why did they call her cursed? Why did they condemn her? Why had she not fought the rope? When I came back in, she was sitting upright, the bread untouched, her eyes tracing the smoke curling to the rafters. Her stillness unsettled me. Most people moved, shifted, fidgeted, but she sat as if carved from stone, as if waiting for me to break first. And I did. "You're safe here," I said, the words rough, unpolished. My voice startled even me. breaking weeks of silence. She didn't answer, but something flickered in her gaze. Not trust, not gratitude, something closer to recognition. That night, as the fire dimmed and shadows stretched long, I lay awake on the floor listening to her breathing. It was steady, unshaken, but there was something beneath it, a rhythm of someone who never truly rests, someone who expects betrayal even in sleep. And then I felt it, the weight of her standing above me. My eyes snapped open, the knife in her hand caught the firelight, trembling slightly, though her grip was firm. She didn't speak. She didn't strike. She simply stood there, a question burning in her silence. Was I another man who would turn her into prey? Was she safer ending me before I could end her? The answer hadn't yet been written. That night I woke to find her standing over me with a knife. Her scars weren't visible until the firelight touched her. Night deepened in the cabin and silence pressed down like snowfall. I sat across from her, the fire snapping between us, throwing shadows against the walls. She kept her veil on, her posture unbroken, eyes fixed on the flames as if trying to disappear inside their dance. For hours she hadn't moved, but I had lived long enough in silence to know that stillness doesn't mean peace. It means restraint. And then the fire shifted, its glow bending across her face. That was when I saw it, not a wound, not a scar carved into flesh, but something deeper. The kind of scar that lived in the way someone held themselves. The kind that no blade could make, but betrayal could. I asked nothing. My voice felt clumsy in the air between us. She spoke without words, her silence heavy as stone, and I understood that if I pressed too hard, she would vanish back into it. So I waited. Finally, she lifted her veil just enough that the firelight caught her skin. That's when truth revealed itself, subtle lines etched into her cheek, faint but deliberate, like ink burned beneath the surface. Not random, not natural, a mark. Her gaze didn't meet mine. Instead, she studied the shadows flickering on the floor. And when she spoke for the first time since I had cut her down, her voice was barely above a whisper. They called me cursed. Her words lodged in me sharper than any blade. She spoke of her husband, how he had been a warrior, how his death had left her shamed, blamed for misfortune that wasn't hers. She told me her people believed her presence brought ruin, that the mark etched into her skin was proof of dishonor. I listened as her voice trembled, breaking and steadying like a wounded bird testing broken wings. I heard not weakness but the weight of carrying abandonment too long. I wanted to tell her I understood that I too carried scars invisible to the world. Scars left by betrayal, by silence, by survival that never healed into living. But the word stuck. Instead, I let the firelight carry the confession neither of us was ready to make. She stopped suddenly, as if afraid of how much she had revealed. The veil slipped back over her face, her silence slamming shut like a door I wasn't meant to open. But before it did, before she hid herself again, she pulled back her sleeve, and that was when I saw it. A mark, sharp and deliberate, burned into her arm. Not just scar, not just shame. Something more. Something I didn't yet understand, but it explained everything. But when she pulled her sleeve back, I saw a mark that explained everything. Her skin bore a mark her people called a curse, but I saw something else entirely. The fire had nearly died when I leaned forward, staring at the mark she had revealed, etched like an old wound but too precise to be accident. The lines formed patterns, almost symbols, though faintly scarred. It wasn't sickness. It wasn't deformity. It was deliberate. She pulled her arm back quickly, wrapping it beneath cloth again, but the image stayed carved into my mind. They said it was a curse, she whispered, her voice trembling as though each word threatened to betray her, a sign that death follows me, that my husband's blood was proof. Her words carried the weight of ritual and judgment, of generations passing down cruelty under the guise of law. But when I looked at her, I didn't see a curse. I saw resilience. I thought of the nights I had stared at my own scars, tracing them with calloused fingers, each one a memory of failure, of survival bought at too high a cost. I knew what it was to carry marks you hadn't chosen, to be defined by stories you didn't write. "You wear survival," I finally said, my voice rough from disuse, "not shame." She froze, her breath catching, as if no one had ever named her mark anything but curse. For the first time I saw a fracture in her silence, not surrender, not trust, but the smallest crack through which something else, hope maybe, might seep. That night, as the fire burned low, I found myself watching her, not with suspicion, but with something more dangerous, protection. Every time the wind howled against the cabin walls, I reached for the rifle at my side, not for myself, but for her. Every creak of the floorboards made me listen harder, not for my safety, but for hers. I had lived years with no one worth guarding. But with her there, with her mark burned into my memory, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to lose her. And just as the thought settled into me, just as the room's silence felt less like exile and more like fragile trust, I heard it, distant, low, rising. Drums, the sound of pursuit, the kind of sound that meant the past she was running from had found its trail again. And then I heard the sound of drums in the distance. A voice that broke me. When she finally spoke, her words cut deeper than any blade I'd ever known. The cabin breathed like a wounded animal, timbers settling, wind threading the chinks, embers sighing as they drifted from red to black. And for hours her silence sat across from me like a witness who refused to testify, until somewhere between the last spark and the first gray of morning she lifted her head, and the smallest sound slipped from her throat, the sound of a door being unlatched in a house no one had visited in years. And I felt it in my ribs before I heard it in my ears, because some doors open inward and pull you with them whether you're ready or not. She didn't say her name. She didn't say thank you. She began with the kind of sentence a person only speaks when there's no more room to keep it inside. "They say I carry death," she murmured, and the words were soft, but they fell with the weight of stones into a well. I made no movement because I knew how easy it is to spook a truth that has finally dared to show itself, and I kept my hands open where she could see them. Palms scarred, fingers blackened from years of fire and solitude, a language I hoped she could read without me adding anything foolish. She told me about the night her husband did not come home, how the men returned with his horse, and a story that changed each time a different mouth carried it, how grief turned the air to sand and left her lungs raw, and how a council gathered with faces that had once smiled at her and now would not meet her eyes. She spoke without drama, each detail laid down like a river stone, there and there and there, until a path emerged that even I could walk with her. They drew the mark. They named her blame. They called the drought her shadow and bad luck her footprint. It wasn't the ritual that hurt her most. It was the recognition that the people who had stood with her at weddings and fires now stood behind a cord of silence, watching as if the verdict had been written long before the trial. I listened and did not interrupt, though the questions flared like sparks. Who drew it? Who decided it? Who benefited from pointing at a widow when fear needed a face? and I kept them in my mouth because her courage to speak deserved room to breathe, not the blunt edge of a man's need to fix what he cannot yet understand. She described the first day she wore the veil as something like walking through smoke. Everyone can see the outline of you, but no one is willing to admit they still recognize your shape. The market turned its back. Children stopped asking her to braid their hair. Even the dogs learned not to follow. She paused and the wind took her place, sliding a cold finger under the door. And I poured water without asking, set the tin beside her, watched her watch it like a thing that could change its mind. And when she finally lifted it, I looked away because acceptance is private. And when the cup settled back onto the plank floor, her voice found a steadier path. Lower now, stronger, as if speaking had become a muscle, remembering its work. She told me how she left not because she wanted to abandon anyone, but because staying meant she would become a mirror no one wanted to look into and a mirror punished for reflecting. She spoke of nights sleeping under brush with her back to a rock so dreams could not sneak up from behind, of counting the stars to measure if the world was still big enough to hold her grief. What I remember most is not the story's shape, but the way she held herself while telling it. Spine straight, hands still, eyes meeting mine and then sliding away. A dance between distance and the dangerous nearness of being seen. Her voice carried strength, yes, the kind hammered in fire rather than born in gentle rooms. But it also carried the unspoken pain of tallying every missed connection in a life that had stopped being invited to the table. And somewhere in that ledger I recognized my own handwriting. I told her little of myself. Not because I wanted to hoard my past, but because this moment belonged to her. Still, some truths walked out unasked. How I once stood outside a diner window and watched a family argue and laugh and argue again. And how the cracked neon sign spelled out a promise called open that didn't include me. And how years later I realized the worst part of abandonment isn't the leaving. It's the way you start to participate in it. How you learn to leave first so no one can get the jump on you. She did not say she understood. She didn't need to. Her gaze softened half a shade, and that was answer enough. When she spoke of the mark again, she did it with an intimacy that felt like placing a blade on the table between us, handle turned my way. It had been cut with care, she said, not by anger but by certainty. A geometry of lines that meant set apart to those who feared what they could not measure. And as she traced its path on her forearm through cloth, I felt an ache that was older than either of us. The ache of being named by other people's fear. I wanted to say the mark looked like a map to me. A way home drawn on skin by pain, too honest to pretend. But I knew metaphors are cheap when a person has bled for the literal. So I bit back the poetry and offered presents instead. Outside the cabin, the mountain made its winter noises, branches listing under frost. A fox testing snow that might not hold. The long-distant groan of ice deciding something it had been postponing. Inside, the air warmed, and with it the careful space between us changed texture. Thinner but not fragile. And I realized we had stepped into a room without walls. A room built of recognition and the quiet bravery of not turning away. I felt the old arithmetic of my life, hurt times distance equals safety, begin to fail, and the failure did not frighten me the way it used to. It humbled me. It opened a door to a corridor I had bricked over, the corridor where second chance is not a miracle but a slow choosing repeated when doubt threatens to unlearn what you've learned. She lifted her veil halfway and then stopped, as if testing whether air could be trusted. And I didn't lean forward because patience is an act of protection too. The fire gave back her features in pieces. Cheekbone, lash, the faintest curve of a scar that did not diminish her as much as frame her. I understood that scars are not the opposite of beauty. They are the proof the body made room for survival. My hand went to the kettle because doing something ordinary keeps a moment from collapsing under its own meaning. And while I poured, she said, "They remember my silence when they need a scapegoat, and forget my voice when they need a witness." And it was so precise a sentence I knew she had practiced it in her head for months without ever expecting to say it aloud. The room held its breath. The spoon clinked against tin. Snow lifted from the roof in a soft slough. And somewhere beyond the ridge a raven called once, which is the mountain's way of reminding a man that stories continue whether he is brave enough to follow them or not. I thought of forgiveness then, not as a pardon stamped by a judge, but as the slow recognition that a person is larger than the worst verdict anyone ever affixed to them. And I felt the first shape of it forming toward myself, which scared me more than any gunshot, because forgiving yourself means you've decided to live here now, with everything that implies. We spoke until the candle thinned. She told me where the bridge crossed the canyon had once been a place of blessing, and how places can be repurposed by fear until they forget their first name. I told her how my cabin had begun as a fort and was becoming a house, and how that difference frightened me because houses gather memories and memories invite accountability. When her voice thinned, I banked the fire and not the conversation, and I could feel the slow, careful bond knitting itself like frost patterns on glass. Delicate, detailed, capable of breaking, yes, but also capable of holding if you learned how to move around it. It was near dawn when she finally crossed the last small distance that still separated us. Not with a touch and not with a confession, but with a single word that changed the air. She said my name, not the one the mountains use, the one I hadn't spoken aloud in years because it sounded too human in my mouth. She said it quietly, like a man might lift a hurt animal, with respect for its fear and tenderness for its bite. My heart misfired once, then caught up, then sped ahead like it wanted to check the road. I hadn't told her. I hadn't offered it. I hadn't even let it rise to my lips when I introduced myself as no one in particular. And then she whispered my name, though I never told her what it was. The tribe hunts. I thought the wilderness was mine until I saw their shadows moving in the trees. Dawn came mean and bright, the kind that doesn't apologize for what the night couldn't finish. The snow had crusted just enough to hold a track, and the ridge threw our smoke down into the pines where anything with a nose could read it like a headline. And I knew before I stepped outside that the day would not belong to the slow work of mending or the small mercy of gathering kindling. It would belong to the run, to the reckonings you can smell before you see them, to the old rule that says peace is a pause and nothing more. The first sign was the silence gone wrong. Birds should have been arguing. Squirrels should have been making a racket of industry in the brush. Instead, the forest held its breath the way gamblers hold their chips when luck takes a seat. I felt the hair at my wrist lift, and I motioned her back without looking, the way a man does when he's asking trust to move before he's earned it fully, and she moved. No question, no sound, which told me we had crossed a line. We were not two strangers in proximity anymore. We were a pair, however provisional, acting on a shared survival rhythm. Shadows slipped where shadows didn't belong. Not wind, not deer, men. 3 to the west flank, 1 high on the game trail where my boot has worn a signature into the slope. 2 coming up the draw with the patience of men who respect bullets enough to avoid them. I counted without counting because counting is muscle, and I felt the old machine in me warm, the one I had promised to keep quiet, and I spoke to it like you speak to a dog that has saved you twice and bitten you once. Heal, but be ready. We had minutes, not hours. I packed what couldn't be replaced in a life. Papers I rarely read, the letter I never sent, the knife my father didn't give me because he didn't stay long enough to hand it over, a tin of salve that smells like the one clinic in town that believes in second chances more than it believes in forms. And I looked at the bedroll where she had slept and watched her fold it with the precision of someone taught to leave no trace, and I recognized in her movement the same refusal I lived by. Do not let the worst thing define your footprint. We slipped the back way along the basalt ledge where the ice clings longer and the prints don't take. I wanted to run. She didn't. She moved at a pace that looked slow until you realized it never faltered. And that steadiness steadied me too. We ghosted the ridge, dropped into the draws, slid under deadfall where snow had made a tunnel, and when we paused to listen, the woods returned only the small opinion of a mink complaining we'd borrowed its route. For a half-mile I let myself believe we'd shaken them, and then a crow rose black from a spruce and told on us with a call too perfectly timed to be chance. They were close. Close enough that I could smell the mix of sweat and tallow and the faint sweet of tobacco on a man who thinks it hides his fear. Close enough that I could hear the careful footfalls of hunters who'd been told to bring a woman back, alive, and the man who stole her back dead. I touched her elbow and felt the heat of her skin through the wool and wished I had the luxury to say something gallant or comforting or even ordinary. But words simplify what readiness needs to stay complex. So I gave her the only truth that serves in a chase. Left at the cut rock, then down. She nodded, and in that nod was a contract. We move together or we don't move. The first shot took the bark from a fir above us, showering us with a rain of splinters that smelled like Christmas mornings I never had. And I pushed her flat as a second shot stitched the air where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. The echo rolled, the birds finally remembered their jobs, and we crawled, elbows, knees, breath, until the slope broke left and dropped us into a shallow basin where snow had drifted into a low white hush. My lungs burned and the scar in my shoulder warmed like a stove iron. The body keeps its ledgers in heat. I set her behind a windthrow and slid forward, counting angles, locating muzzle flash memories, listening for the telltale clack of a man who doesn't know his rifle is short stroking. 2 on the draw, 1 moving to high ground, 1 patient to our right who didn't fire because he was waiting for a face, not a shape. Professionals and hotheads braided together by someone who knew to mix them. The odds were the same as always. Bad but not hopeless if you honor the math. The first man came low and fast, and I let him pass my position because you never fight a man where he's ready. You fight him where his plan runs out. When he reached the far side of the log, I rose and used the butt of the rifle the way it was used before men got sentimental about steel. And when he folded, I took his belt knife because knives are friendlier than guns when the woods are close. The second pushed hard at the sound, and I met him with a short, loud truth. 2 rounds center, one for his mistake of thinking a shout could pin me. And the forest took the echo, filed it with the others, and pretended it hadn't heard a thing. I wanted to keep them alive. I did not succeed with both. Some fights ask you to choose between mercy and math, and if you choose wrong, no one goes home. I am learning to carry that sentence without letting it eat the rest of the page. We moved again, curve and drop, until the creek's voice found us. Water makes its own cover, and we waded the edge so our prints would lie for us, the cold biting high and mean until feeling went away and argued no more. Twice she stumbled and twice she recovered without taking my hand, and I respected that until the third time came and the rock was slick as conscience, and I gave her my wrist and she took it without flinching. And for 3 breaths we were the same person leaning the same direction, because partnership is mostly that. A tiny agreement repeated before either of you has time to betray it. They pressed. I could feel their distance the way a man feels weather change through a scar. Close enough now that talk would begin. Not taunts, not yet, but the steady low choir of men reminding themselves they are not afraid. I wanted to answer with silence, but silence can be mistaken for weakness by people who don't speak it. So I chose noise. I cracked a branch, let it fall, and watched their eyes pull toward the wrong sound, and in that one soft theft of attention I put a round through the shoulder of the one who looked like he'd been made leader for the day, and his shout rekeyed the music of the chase. We reached the notch I had hoped for, a narrow between black rock where only one man can pass at a time if he wishes to keep his blood inside. And I set her through first, turned and held, counting seconds, buying them with gun oil and breath and the familiar thud of recoil that I will always know too well. The last of my rounds went to air as warning rather than flesh as punishment, and it worked on 2 but not on the third, who came straight and hard because grief or pride had cut his leash. And we met palm to wrist in the old dance every boy learns the first time he's told to hold his own, and when it was done his knife lay in the snow, and so did his certainty, and I told him to go home, and he told me home had moved on without him. We ran. There's no shame in that word when you're escorting a life that still owes itself a future. The ridge opened. The pines gave way to aspens bright as coins, and through them I could see the long, dark shoulder of storm stacking over the far range, which would help us if we could last until it decided to spend itself here. My chest begged the sky for more room, my legs filed formal complaints, but the part of me that has always walked 1 more mile than he thinks he can kept its counsel and carried us. I thought then, not for long, because thinking gets a man killed when the next footfall matters more than the last regret, but enough to lay a single brick, that I did not want to be defined forever by the rooms I had refused to enter. I wanted just once to stand up in the open and be counted on purpose. I wanted her to see the line I kept hidden and know that if she stepped over it I would not move it to save myself. That is a dangerous kind of wanting. It changes what a man does with his last bullet. We reached the saddle where the wind blows meanest and the world briefly remembers how to be horizon. And in that exposure, everything feels honest because there is nowhere to hide your lies. They came at us all at once, as men do when they've been told this is the place to end it. And the fight got close and ugly, teeth and elbows. The sort where names are no use and breath is a currency you spend without counting. I kept her behind me but not under me, because protection that erases a person is just another kind of harm. And when she moved with purpose. Throwing a fistful of snow dirt into a man's eyes, swinging a branch with both hands like a bell ringer who intends the town to hear. 2 fell back, 1 stayed, 1 learned. I took a cut, shallow but loud, and the pain brightened the edges of the world the way pain does when it's doing its job. He came again and I went with him, not away from him, and we rolled and the sky rolled with us, and for a second I smelled the same soap my unit used to wash blood from hands that did not deserve cleansing. And the memory threw me, and he used the throw, and his blade kissed my coat and did not like the taste. I ended it with a truth I do not enjoy remembering. Some endings are like that, necessary, not noble, and the body keeps score even when the mind wants to call the game a draw. The others saw and measured the cost of continuing and slowed without saying they were slowing. And I stood there with snow in my teeth and old anger in my eyes, and I waited to see if wisdom had any disciples among them today. That's when one more stepped from the trees, not charging, not aiming, simply standing with the steadiness of someone who thinks decisions should take their time. He wore authority like a coat that fit him too well to be borrowed. His gaze measured her first, then me, then the ground between us, and something in that gaze reached back years to a night under a different sky, where a different man made a choice we both failed to stop. Recognition can be slow and still hit like a fall. He said nothing. I said nothing. The wind did the talking for all of us, slapping the ridge clean. I raised my rifle 1/2 inch, and he raised his palm 1/2 inch, and the exchange wrote itself. Not yet. Not like this. Behind him, the men I had hurt tried to become smaller than their injuries. Beside me, I felt her breath steady into the same count as mine. I should have been relieved to see a pause wedge itself into the day, but pauses are where memory does its worst math. The man's jaw worked as if grinding down a word too bitter to swallow whole, and he stepped forward into the space where men who used to agree now disagree and must decide whether to admit it. And as the light hit the scar along his temple, I felt the floor drop out from under time, because I knew that face, not as hunter, not as judge, as a figure from my own ledger, the kind of name you box in with pencil because you intend to return to it when you're braver. One of the men I struck down. I knew his face from my past. By then we weren't strangers anymore. We were fugitives bound by silence and blood. The snow swallowed our trail almost as soon as we made it, flakes folding over our footprints like a hand erasing a secret. The air was sharp, cutting through my lungs with every breath, but her steps never faltered. She stayed close, her veil brushing my shoulder when the path narrowed, her silence pressing into me with the weight of trust unspoken. For days I had walked alone, believing that silence was armor. But with her there, silence became something else, a bond, fragile but binding. A thread spun between 2 people who had nothing left but the will to survive. We didn't speak as we climbed through the narrow ridges, frost breaking loose from branches above us and showering in brief cascades of silver. The wilderness watched us, vast and indifferent, yet it felt different now that she walked beside me. Every time the wind howled, I glanced toward her, expecting her to falter, but she didn't. She met the wild with the same quiet defiance she had shown on the bridge, and though she didn't know it, her strength dragged me forward when my body begged me to stop. That night we lit a fire no larger than my palm. Its embers crouched low inside a ring of stones. She sat opposite me, her veil slipping loose as she leaned toward the warmth. For the first time she didn't fix it back over her face. Firelight painted her scars in shifting shades of amber and shadow, and I found myself staring not with pity but with recognition. I had my own scars, invisible but no less sharp, and in her face I saw them reflected back. She didn't offer beauty. She didn't need to. What she offered was presence, her whole self, unhidden, unflinching. It was more than I deserved, and more than I had thought I'd ever be given again. She broke bread with careful hands, placed half on a flat stone between us, and slid it toward me. Such a small thing, yet my throat tightened around it. I took it not because I was hungry, but because I understood what it meant. It wasn't food she was offering. It was trust, carved out of silence and firelight. She didn't look at me and I didn't thank her, but both of us knew that something had shifted. At dawn we stopped at the river. The surface was black, rippled with ice, and when I bent to drink, her reflection appeared beside mine. My face was the ruin I had grown used to, beard tangled, eyes hollowed by solitude, skin weathered by years of exile. But hers, scarred though it was, held something mine didn't. Resilience without bitterness, strength that bent but never broke. For the first time, I didn't look away from my reflection. I looked at ours side by side, and I realized we weren't widow and outlaw anymore. We were two survivors bound not by blood, but by silence and the choice not to abandon. By the third night, our rhythm had changed. Every decision, when to hide, when to run, when to rest, wasn't mine alone. It belonged to both of us. When the cold bit too deep, I pulled my coat across her shoulders. When I leaned too far over the ridge for water, her hand caught my wrist, steadying me before I slipped. Neither of us named what was growing between us, but the silence confessed it better than words ever could. It was intimacy without touch, connection without confession, a fragile bond that felt more dangerous than any rifle pointed at my chest. But the wild has no mercy for fugitives. Just when the quiet between us felt less like exile and more like home, I saw them. Across the ridge, the darkness flared with fire, torches lined like a wall of judgment, waiting for us. But when we reached the ridge, torches already burned on the other side. The chains on my wrists weren't as heavy as the guilt in my chest. They came with the dawn, shadows crawling through the mist, moving with the patience of hunters who had tracked prey all their lives. We ran, weaving through snow-laden pines, but they had already closed the circle. I fired until the chamber clicked empty, each shot tearing echoes into the trees, but it wasn't enough. Hands gripped me from behind, a rifle butt crashed against my skull, and the world tilted into black. When I woke, my wrists screamed beneath the bite of iron. Shackles, heavy and cold, cut into the skin until I bled. My body was battered, ribs bruised with every shallow breath, yet none of that mattered. What mattered was the absence beside me. She was gone. I heard her before I saw her. Not her words, she gave them nothing, but the sound of her being dragged across frozen ground, veil torn, steps unsteady. She didn't cry out, didn't plead. Her silence cut through the night louder than their jeers. They mocked her, cursed her, but she met them with the same defiance she had shown death on the bridge, and that silence hollowed me because I was powerless to answer it. The beatings began. Fists, boots, the crack of wood splitting against bone. I didn't cry out. I had learned long ago that silence breaks men faster than pain. But this silence felt different. It wasn't armor this time. It was shame. Every strike reminded me of the truth. I had promised myself I would protect her, and here I was, chained like a dog, watching her dragged away. Survival had defined me for years, but what good was survival if it left me with nothing but guilt? Blood blurred my vision, dripping into the dirt, but I forced my eyes open. Through the haze, I saw her once more. They were dragging her past the fire, away into the trees, her body small against the mob. She didn't resist, didn't turn her head, didn't look back. That absence of a glance cut deeper than any chain, any blade, any blow. For years I had lived as if my life was already over, haunting the mountains, hiding from men, from myself. But in that moment I realized there was something worse than death. It was this: being forgotten by the one person who had finally seen me. Through blurred eyes I saw them drag her away, and she didn't look back. Fire in my veins. A man with nothing left can still fight, but a man with someone to protect is unstoppable. I woke in the dirt, blood crusted in my mouth, chains biting so deep into my wrists that they felt part of my skin. Pain had always been a companion, but this was different. This wasn't survival, it was humiliation. My chest rose and fell with the rhythm of failure, and for a moment I let myself believe it was over, that my body would rot here nameless, while she was dragged back into exile or worse. But then I remembered the look she didn't give me, how she hadn't turned back when they took her. That silence had cut deeper than any blow. It wasn't because she didn't care. It was because she had already buried me in her heart, and I couldn't allow that to be the end of my story. I pulled against the chains until blood slicked my wrists. Every shackle clink echoed like a dare. My captors thought I was beaten, but they didn't know what desperation could do to a man who had lived with nothing. The fire inside me had gone cold years ago, dulled by loneliness and wasted sins, but now it roared back to life. Not for me, for her. I had survived gunfire, betrayal, starvation, winters that could freeze a man's bones, but this time survival wasn't the goal. She was. When they left me to die beneath the tree, I listened. To the rhythm of their boots, to the direction of their voices. I memorized the crack of each branch, the spacing of their laughter, the weight of their weapons against their belts. And when the camp quieted, I acted. I wrenched my wrists until skin tore, slipped one blood-soaked hand free, and used the chain itself as my first weapon. Steel wrapped around a guard's throat before he even knew the night. Had teeth. His body hit the earth without a sound. I took his knife, cut myself loose, and for the first time in years I felt the fire in my veins run hotter than fear. I followed the trail they had left behind. The broken brush, the blood-darkened snow, the drum beats that had haunted us since the ridge. Each step was pain. Each step was purpose. I wasn't tracking prey. I was hunting my own redemption. The wilderness tried to slow me, but rage made me relentless. I tore through undergrowth, scaled ridges slick with frost, bled into the snow but never stopped. My mind saw her even when my eyes didn't, kneeling before fire, hands bound, veil torn, silence stolen. Every image made my pulse sharper, my breath heavier, my resolve harder. Hours later I smelled smoke. I heard the faint rise of voices, the chanting of men who believed they had already won. I crept closer, belly to the ground, eyes burning with sweat and blood. And then I saw her. kneeling in the center of the fire's glow, her hands bound, her face shadowed and a blade pressed against her throat. I found her, but she was on her knees with a blade against her throat. The reckoning, the blood I spilled that night wasn't for survival, it was for redemption. The camp exploded in fire and steel. I hit them like a storm breaking against timber, and the first man never had time to scream. My blade found his ribs, my boot crushed his jaw, and then the other surged forward in fury. It wasn't a fight, it was release. Every strike carried the weight of years I had spent hiding, the guilt I had carried like a chain, the loneliness that had hollowed me out. I didn't fight for survival, I fought for her. Men swarmed, but desperation made me faster. Their blades caught my skin, but I gave flesh to take bone. Blood sprayed across the firelight, and their chants turned to screams. I felt their weight pressing me down, but each time I fell I rose sharper, fueled by the fire in my chest, and through the chaos I kept her in my sight. Her silence was a beacon, her stillness the center of the storm. Then he appeared, taller than the rest, eyes burning with something deeper than hate. Garin, the tribe's leader. His voice cut through the noise, heavy with authority, his blade gleaming as he stepped forward. The others fell back, circling us, leaving space for the duel they knew was coming. He looked at me not as prey, not as enemy, but as something personal. "You were one of us once," he growled. The words hit harder than his first strike. I had buried that truth long ago, hidden it beneath years of wandering and shame. Betrayal wasn't new to me, but hearing it from his lips made every scar ache fresh. We clashed steel on steel, sparks flying into the night. His strength was brutal, each blow meant to break bone and memory alike. But I didn't yield. Every parry, every counter was fueled not by rage alone, but by the truth that I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the woman behind him, for the chance to prove I wasn't the curse the world had named me. The duel dragged, brutal and raw. Blood soaked the earth beneath our feet, sweat blinding my eyes, lungs burning. Finally I broke through, drove him to his knees, my blade pressing against his throat. The fire roared around us, the tribe watching in breathless silence. For one heartbeat I wanted nothing more than to end him, to carve my vengeance into his skin, to silence the ghosts he had awakened in me. And then, her voice, sharp, fragile, terrifying in its power, she screamed my name. Not with anger, not with command, but with desperation, begging me not to kill. I pressed my blade to his throat when she screamed my name, begging me not to kill. Beneath the final veil, when she lifted her veil for the last time, I saw not shame, but salvation. The battlefield was quiet now, but not empty. Smoke curled into the dawn, rising like memories that refused to burn out. The ground was littered with remnants of violence. Blood that would stain the soil long after we were gone. Broken weapons abandoned like unspoken truths. Silence that carried the weight of things lost forever. My blade slipped from my hand, falling heavy into the dirt, and for the first time in years I felt the weight of loneliness lifting. Not because the scars had vanished, but because she was still there. She hadn't turned away. She hadn't disappeared like the others. She stepped into the fading firelight, veil loose in her hand. For so long that cloth had been her shield, the mask that kept her hidden from eyes that only ever judged, cursed, or condemned. But now she held it differently, not as a barrier, but as a choice. Her fingers trembled, though not with fear, with the weight of recognition. When she raised her hand and pulled the veil away, I saw her as she truly was. The scar across her cheek, the mark her people had branded as a curse. And yet in that moment it was no curse. It was survival etched into flesh, resilience carved into skin, a silent testament to a woman who had endured betrayal, abandonment, and still carried the strength to lift her head. I wanted to speak, to tell her what I saw, but words felt clumsy against the intimacy of silence. She didn't need declarations. What she needed was presence. The quiet truth of a man who had finally learned that scars weren't things to hide, but things to carry with pride. I stepped closer, my hand rising not to claim her, not to comfort her, but to trace the air just beside her cheek, close enough to feel her warmth. It was a vow without language. I see you. I will not turn away. For years I had lived like a ghost, wandering cracked sidewalks where no one remembered my name, staring at mirror reflections in half-lit motels, drowning nights in whiskey while empty penthouses whispered reminders of what I had lost. Loneliness had been my only companion and violence my only purpose. But now, standing before her, I understood that survival had never been the end of the story. Healing was. Redemption was. Second chances were. And she was the proof of that truth. Her mark was not a curse. It was a letter of truth written on her skin, one I had been meant to read. It spoke of nights spent abandoned, of silence carried like chains, of wounds that never fully closed yet never stopped her from moving forward. And as I looked at her, I realized my own scars had been telling the same story all along. Bruised pasts, hidden pain, emotional distance, quiet transformations. The world had taught us to hide, but here in the hush of dawn we chose not to. I reached down, lifted her hand, and for a heartbeat we simply stood there, saying nothing. It was not the love of fairy tales, not the kind written in grand declarations or destined endings. It was raw, unpolished, and fragile. A bond born of survival, of faceless attraction that had grown into emotional intimacy, of unspoken connection that needed no proof beyond this moment. It was love that did not erase scars but honored them. The sun broke slowly across the horizon, turning the sky into fractured gold. In its light, her face was no longer hidden, no longer cursed, no longer outcast. It was simply hers. And in her reflection, I found my own rebirth. I was not the savage outlaw anymore, not the lonely ghost, not the man who believed survival was enough. I was something else now. A man who had been given a second chance not because he deserved it, but because he finally chose to stop running from it. I mounted my horse as the first rays of dawn stretched across the world. She stood there, veil in her hands, her silence no longer heavy but full of possibility. I didn't know if she would ride with me, or if our paths would part like roads diverging after a missed connection. But it didn't matter, because whatever came next, she had given me something I thought I had lost forever. Recognition, forgiveness, redemption. As the horse carried me into the light, I looked back one last time. She stood tall, scars bared, veil forgotten, dawn gathering around her like armor. I touched my own chest, feeling the weight of my scars not as chains, but as proof that I had lived, endured, and finally chosen differently. I rode into the dawn knowing I'd never wear my scars the same way again, because hers had become mine.